Good evening, community. I hope you are all in good spirits to enjoy some horror stories and encounters with the paranormal. If not, I hope the next few minutes help you escape from any worries you may have. I promise that tonight you will hear great stories in this episode, from strange encounters in a mysterious cave to apparitions in the rooms of the protagonists, from road spirits that seem to follow the unlucky ones who encounter them, to a mysterious goat that walks on two legs through the mountains, scaring anyone who dares to cross them. Are you ready? It's time to let yourself go. Turn off the lights, and hope you're not the next protagonist of Night Tales. Hello, Oriel. I would like to tell a story that happened to me and three of my friends, Fernando, Jose, and Pablo last year. I am from Zamora, Michoacan, and here there is a place called La Beata, a site with many legends, although I heard about something similar to what happened to us. It's a rather large hill with a huge cross at the top that can be seen from some parts of the city. It's customary to climb it at a certain time of year when a lot of people gather and make the journey, which is quite long, approximately 6 hours of walking until reaching the top. Once they reach the top, they camp all night and return the next day. This story begins one night at a gathering with friends. With a few beers in us, we started talking about trips we should all take together. Those that remain just talk and never happen. Until Fernando said, "I know! What if we climb La Beata? I know an alternative route where we can take less time. I've climbed it several times with my dad. Plus, it's not the season for people to climb, so we might be alone." We all agreed, thinking it would just remain talk. A week passed until Fernando asked in our WhatsApp group when we were really going. I think no one actually wanted to do it, but we all said yes to avoid making him feel bad. We agreed to go on a weekend. The day arrived, and we met at Fernando's house on Saturday at 5 a.m. to start early and not just as planned. On Saturday, we were all at his house with our backpacks full of food and water because we wouldn't be coming back until the next day. So we started climbing. After about 3 hours of walking, Jose suddenly said, "Wait, turn it off. I hear something." We quickly turned off the speaker we had with us, and if we listened closely, we could hear the bleating of a goat in the distance. I don't know much about it, but I know there shouldn't be goats in that area. We ignored the sound after a few seconds and continued walking. About 15 minutes later, Jose said again, "There it is, the one making the sounds." And a few meters away, we saw a large billy goat with impressive horns. Pablo said, "Let's catch it, and on the way back, we can see if we can sell it." We all dropped our backpacks and started chasing it. At one point, we split up, and in the distance, we heard Fernando scream. When we reached him, he was sitting on the ground catching his breath and told us, "I had caught it, but it bit me and got away." We started laughing until he showed us his forearm where the goat had bitten him. It didn't look serious, but it was bleeding a lot. We started treating it with what we had, and then he said, "That thing had tremendous strength. My dad has goats, even bigger ones, but none with the strength of the one that got away." We continued mocking him and started looking for our backpacks. We found them one by one until we saw Fernando's hanging high up in a tree. We asked if he had put it there, and he said no. He said, "Surely one of you hung it there. Come on, help me get it down." When we got it down, it smelled awful, like something rotten. We thought it was the food he had brought, spoiled by the heat. We didn't pay much attention and kept climbing. The day went on normally, except that inside Fernando's backpack, we found a dead bird, almost rotting. Very angry, he asked who the prankster was that had put it there. We all said none of us had done it. We just threw it away and continued the day as normally as possible, though we still heard that goat's bleeding. Until early morning, we heard it in the distance, but then it got very close. It was almost 2 a.m. when it started, waking us all up. Jose was the first to see it and said, "This time it won't get away," and started running after it. The goat also started running, and when Jose was about to catch it, he lunged and grabbed it by a leg. Even though it seemed Jose weighed nothing, the goat dragged him for several meters until he let go. We kept running after it until, I swear, the goat stood on 2 legs and ran that way, shouting, "Fernando, Fernando." And I promise you it was laughing at us. We stood frozen until we looked at Fernando. He was crouched, vomiting and crying like a little kid while the laughter faded away. None of us could speak. The words wouldn't come out. When we finally could, we realized Pablo wasn't with us. We started looking for him and found him not far away, crying with his head between his knees. He wouldn't stop crying until he said, I kept following it, followed that thing until it spoke to me, but it spoke with my mom's voice. Pablo's mom had passed away a few months before. He never told us what that thing said to him to make him react that way, and honestly, we don't want to know. We couldn't sleep anymore, and as soon as it was 4:30 in the morning, we started our way back. It took us much longer than usual to return because we could still hear the goats bleating following us. When we finally got back, Fernando's dad saw how pale we were and asked what had happened to us. When we told him all the details, he said, "Boys, I've seen it too, but I just ignored it. When it saw I was ignoring it, it started speaking to me with my father's voice, saying things only he and I knew, and it laughed. I couldn't stand it and came back. That thing is the same. I hadn't heard about it for years until you told me. If you ever want to go back up there, be very careful with all the things that roam around on the way." Obviously, none of us ever went back up there. It never even crossed our minds to return to that place where we had the worst experience of our lives. But anyway, I hope you liked my story. Thank you very much, and we take this opportunity to send greetings to Zamora and all of Michoacan, where the previous story took place. We ask everyone living there if they have ever experienced or heard of someone who has gone through something similar. It's undoubtedly a macabre yet fascinating apparition. You know we'll be waiting for your stories, no matter how incredible they may seem. But now, let's continue with a story that reminds us that sometimes the ghosts of the road. Hello community, I want to share an experience from a few weeks ago. This is the third story I'm sharing about what has happened to me in my career as a trucker. I had left my base in Guadalajara heading towards Monterrey, driving calmly as always, attentive to the road. The early hours caught me around 2:50 a.m. on the Matehuala Strait. Everything was going perfectly until something began that I can only explain as paranormal. A few months ago, my grandfather passed away. May he rest in peace. As I was driving, suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I saw him sitting next to me in the passenger seat. It didn't scare me, but I didn't dare to look directly at him for fear he would disappear. I simply kept driving, speechless, as he just looked at me with. I could feel his smile, I could feel his peace. I felt a tranquility that I haven't been able to feel since. I think it was about 20 seconds or so. I glanced at him, and in a whisper, he said, "Take care of yourself, my friend." Upon hearing that, I wanted to cry but held back the tears. When I no longer saw my grandfather, I felt another presence, but this one was very different. I felt a lot of chills, and suddenly, I started smelling something very unpleasant, like rotting meat, as if I had run over a skunk. An inexplicable odor. I rolled down the windows to let the smell out, tried to grab the air freshener, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone behind me in the bed. I didn't want to turn around, grabbed the freshener, put on Christian music, and turned the volume down 3 times. I tried not to think about it, just tried to concentrate on the road, not to have an accident. Luckily, I was near to reaching my rest. The days passed, and I felt it. Was I days off suddenly, heard talking, saw sometimes? I used to ask them who they were talking to, and they would just tell me it was Momo inviting them to go play with him. It threw me off, and I started investigating and, above all, watching over them closely. But as the days passed, I had to go back to work. My partner told me the kids weren't the same anymore, that they were acting strange, quiet, distracted. I had to think quickly because this wasn't normal anymore. The most important thing was to get back home and be with them. A few days ago, I took some time off to be with my family, and boy, did we all need it. We were so happy to see each other that it seemed like we had forgotten about what had been tormenting us in the previous weeks. One night, I got up to use the bathroom at 3:18 in the morning. I left the room and saw my daughter with someone, a silhouette in the darkness, about my height, holding her hand. I reacted by running and hugging my daughter. I got my son and brought them both into our room, closed the door, turned on the light, and asked my daughter who that was, who was with her. She answered again, "It's Momo." At that moment, the door began to creak as if it were about to burst, not as if someone was behind it, but as if it were about to burst from within. I don't know why, but I told my children to tell it to leave. Surprisingly, they did, and somehow that worked. Shortly after, the door stopped creaking, and everything fell silent. Since then, we haven't heard anything, and they haven't seen Momo again. I hope that's the end of that story, that whatever it was has returned to wherever I brought it from. I hope Momo is no longer here. Good evening and greetings from the corner of Mexico. For privacy reasons, I will change or omit real names, but I dare to share this story after many years. I'm someone who says they don't believe in paranormal things, but for some reason, I've witnessed these inexplicable occurrences that I'd like to share another time. Now, I'd like to begin with this story. I hope you consider it, and thank you for your work. I'm from Tijuana, a border city in the state of Baja California, Mexico. This city is known for its large flow of immigrants. Personally, I've come into contact with many people trying to cross illegally into the United States, ending up here in Tijuana for one reason or another. One day, while talking at work, I noticed a colleague looking a bit sad and discouraged, so I asked him what was wrong. On a day like today, but years ago, I arrived in this city. I can tell you something, but please don't make fun of me, he replied, surprising me because he was usually very serious. He began to tell me about his journey to reach the United States from Zedel, Durango. First, everything seemed normal. I had heard many similar stories here in Tijuana. Stories of people who don't make it across the border and end up staying here, which are commonplace. The unusual part of my colleague's story began when he reached the state of Chihuahua. He said the person driving the truck dropped him and others off, telling them, "Here's where I leave you. You'll walk about 3 or 4 hours northeast from here to reach a camp where the coyote will be." Coyote is the term for people who help others cross into the United States illegally, also known as paleros. According to my colleague, it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they started walking. After about an hour and a half, my colleague started feeling nervous because the further they walked, the mountainous terrain gave him a bad feeling, and he wasn't very convinced about continuing the path. It's well known that sometimes, coyotes leave people to fend for themselves without crossing them to the other side. After about another hour, they were deep into the mountains, with no signs of settlements or people for miles and miles. My colleague and another person decided to turn back to the road. The others refused and preferred to keep going. He said it was autumn, and in the Chihuahua Mountains it was very cold. They had been walking back for about an hour when the cold became unbearable. In the distance, they saw a light coming from a hilltop and immediately thought it could be the coyote. They hurried to climb up, but all they found at the top was a cave. There were no lights or anything indicating someone had been there. They stood there, looking at each other, and since the cold was so intense, they decided to spend the night in that cave. They planned to figure out how to get back to their towns the next day. After a few minutes, my colleague managed to fall asleep. He woke up around 6 o'clock in the morning and realized his companion was gone, which seemed very strange to him. He shouted for about 10 minutes too. Suddenly, he felt something approaching him from inside the cave. He turned immediately and saw his companion. The cave seemed to be very deep, but the entrance was small, barely 1.5 meters high. When he saw his companion emerging from the depths, he immediately noticed something was very wrong. The man didn't seem the same physically or mentally. His companion, who was between 30 and 35 years old, looked over 50 that morning. His hair was gray, his skin wrinkled as if he had been in the sun for hours, and he seemed disoriented. The man mumbled incomprehensibly and couldn't even stand up. He fell asleep, and after about an hour, my colleague woke him up so they could leave. He dragged him down the hill, and once at the bottom, he managed to carry him to the road. They waited about 40 minutes until a truck carrying a load of hay passed by. My colleague asked for a ride, and with the help of the driver, they loaded the man onto the truck and headed to the nearest town. Upon reaching the town, they took the man to the only doctor in the area, who examined him. After a thorough checkup, the doctor told my colleague that the man was severely malnourished. A very serious case of malnutrition and dehydration, as if he hadn't had water in days, which made no sense since they had water and food in their backpacks that day. Later, the man woke up and finally could speak. When he looked at my colleague, he told him what had happened. It turned out that when they fell asleep in the cave, the man suddenly woke up and heard voices coming from deep inside. He was curious to find out who else was there, but remembered the light they had seen and decided to walk into the darkness to see what he could find. He walked and walked into the darkness, and once inside, he noticed it was much larger. He saw people down there dressed in clothes that weren't from their time. In fact, they didn't seem to be from the area. They had very pale skin and wore clothes that looked like they were from indigenous people, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. A woman suddenly noticed him staring at them in the darkness, approached him. She was much taller than him, and offered him 3 apples. When he ate one of them, he began to feel burning and pain throughout his body. After that, he saw a blinding light, fell to the ground, and heard them shouting his name. He wanted to follow them, and the next thing he knew, he was crawling towards. When my colleague told him all this, obviously my colleague was scared. As incredible as the story sounded, the man looked older than he did just a day before, and that had no explanation. But without prolonging the story, my colleague lost track of the cave's location because he didn't know exactly which kilometer of the highway they were on. After that, he didn't want to go back and decided to continue his journey, but this time heading west until he reached Tijuana, where he stayed. The last thing he told me is that his nephew called the man's cell phone, and his mom answered. Unfortunately, that travel companion died at a young age shortly after he regained his strength. He returned to his hometown where he lived for another year, but his mom said he never fully recovered. On the contrary, he gradually lost strength and muscle mass. Being from a very poor background, they probably never did the necessary medical tests. In fact, according to his mom, the man's body was so small and thin that he looked like an 11-year-old child, as if something had consumed his body. I insist, community, I'm not a believer, but what my colleague told me that day left me deeply pensive. There are other stories I could tell you. I will just say, I worked embalming bodies here in Tijuana, and I'm happy to soon share my stories. Greetings and success. Thank you very much for sticking around, community. I want to thank the people of Ciudad Juarez who welcomed us with such warmth. A warmth felt in every hug. Truly, thank you to everyone who came to greet us at the book presentation at the Border Book Fair. To those who couldn't stay due to the heat or the wait, don't worry. I'll find a way to return. Stay tuned for now, Pachuca, Oaxaca, and Monterrey, because we'll be seeing each other very soon for more book presentations. Remember, you can find the book in your nearest bookstore or online at almost any bookstore you prefer and trust. Of course, I'll leave a link in the description of this episode. Thanks for everything, and let's continue because we still have one more story tonight. Hello, Uriel and community. My name is Daniel, and I'm from Leon, Guanajuato. I want to say that I'm skeptical, yes, even after what I'm about to tell you. Unless someone could explain to me what I saw, what I'm about to tell you is the strangest episode I've ever experienced. While it may be a short event and perhaps not so terrifying to many, for me it was chilling. The possibility that everything recounted here, for example, might be real means a lot. I was 18 years old when I shared a room with my older brother. Each of us had our own bed, separated by a window through which we could see the street from our second-floor room. Outside, there's a short cement structure barely big enough for a flower pot. One night, I woke up shortly after 2 in the morning. Something suddenly roused me, but I wasn't sure what. I glanced at my brother, who was sound asleep. He has an extremely heavy sleep. I could see his face because moonlight filtered through a gap in the curtain, casting a line of light across his face. Suddenly, the light disappeared as if something had covered the gap. I looked towards the window to see if the curtain had somehow closed, but it hadn't. As I focused my attention and adjusted to the darkness, I noticed that something was blocking the gap where the light had been. I stood up, approached the window, and opened the curtains. Outside, I saw a man peering through the window. A man with his face covered by shadows, wearing what seemed like a monk's robe and a hood over his head. I recoiled and shouted at my brother, who didn't wake up. I ran to the door. I shouted for my mom to come because there was someone outside, but I didn't get a response. I couldn't understand how someone could be at the window when there wasn't enough space for them to stand there, especially on the second floor. When I looked back towards the window, I was surprised to see that the person wasn't there anymore. Instead, something made me turn towards the corner of my room, and the monk was already inside. All I could do was close my eyes and think, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming. Convinced that it was all a dream, I reached out, turned on the light, and when I opened my eyes again, he was gone. I ran downstairs to wake up my mom and told her what had just happened. That I had a horrible, very real dream where I woke up and saw someone in my room. She took a figurine of the Virgin Mary. On a trip to the Basilica of Guadalupe, they gave us a figurine of the Virgin Mary. When we returned home, my mom brought the figurine and holy water to calm me down. She asked me where I had seen the monk, and I pointed to the corner. She sprinkled water there, and what happened next makes me think that maybe this wasn't just a dream. As she sprinkled the water, the room's light started flickering, almost going completely out, as if the bulb was about to burn out. Neither my mom nor I knew what to say. Neither of us could explain what happened. I know it may not sound scary to some, but believe me, it was to me. I wonder if anyone else has seen something similar, a being like the one I described. If anyone could tell me what it means or anything related to it. Since then, voices and unexplainable sounds have been common in my house. Thank you and good night, community. And please don't open your windows tonight.